All right, so today we're covering chapter 6, which is continuing the flow of food. We've gone through purchasing, receiving, and storage of the food. And today we're going to talk about the preparation of the food. Okay, so first thing to talk about, we've talked about, I think, in every class, you got to make sure that what you're working with is clean and sanitized. So your knives, your cutting boards, all your utensils, your work table, all of that's cleaned and sanitized before you start to work. Again, we only take as much food out of the cooler as we can handle in a short period of time. And what are we trying to prevent when we do that? Time temperature abuse. Okay, good. It says it on the screen. Did you know that or did you read it? Okay. Get the prep food back to the cooler or cook it as quickly as possible. So you don't want that bacteria to have time to grow. Okay. Food and color additives. You might want to add something to different types of food in order to help extend its shelf life. You have to know what your local health authority is going to allow you to do. Of course, you can never add more additives than they're permitted by law. You're not supposed to use additives to alter the appearance of food. So if you had like a case of fresh tuna steaks, you couldn't inject those with like a reddish purple food color to make it look fresher. Don't sell produce that was treated with sulfites before it was received in the operations, and then never add sulfites to food that is going to be eaten raw. Okay. Present food honestly. So again, like same kind of thing, like don't add something to it that's going to make it look fresher than it actually is. And you might add something to it that's going to just like take away a brown color and make it look like it's bright red or its natural color. Plastic wrap. I know they used to sell this to people at their homes, like a bluish kind of color plastic wrap instead of the absolutely clear color. And different tints can make the food that's wrapped up look fresher than it really is. So you cannot do that in a restaurant. Also, different lights. If I'm looking in here, it's hard to tell with this thing on, but some lights are warmer and some lights are colder. Colder lights are what you tend to see like in a doctor's office or in a hospital. You can see each and every little detail of things. But any different color spectrum of lights can make foods look fresher. And we're not allowed to do that type of thing. Present food in the way that it was described. Their example is if you have fresh perch on your menu and you run out of it, you can't substitute catfish and not tell the guest. You can't let them think that they're really getting perch. Food that is not presented honestly must be thrown out. Okay, general preparation practices. We have to throw food out in the following situations. Anytime somebody that gets sick during the shift that has been working with food, the food that they've worked with has to be thrown out. If it's contaminated by hands that aren't properly washed, or bodily fluids such as sneezing, or if somebody cuts and bleeds on something, you have to throw that food away. And then, of course, when it's exceeded time temperature requirements. So if it's in the temperature danger zone between 41 and 135 for more than 4 hours, you're gonna have to get rid of it. Oh, okay. So now we're going to talk about thawing food. Um, there's a lot of reasons why food is kept frozen. It extends the shelf life of it, but then when you need to cook it, you can't always cook it from a frozen stage. Something like a turkey that's photographed here, you need to cool that, yeah, to thaw it out slowly. There is no really fast way to thaw out a turkey. Um, so usually what we do is we plan ahead, we pull things that out of the freezer, put them into the cooler, and let them thaw in the cooler because we know they'll never go above 41 degrees in the cooler. Um, an alternative is submerging all of the food under running cold water. So we would actually need lots of props. Actually need a container like this, maybe bigger for a turkey. Um, you fill it with, put the turkey in there, put the cold water in, and then have the cold water running so there's a continuous flow of water going over it. And if you're doing that, you have to do it in a clean, sanitized prep sink. You can't do it in a pot sink or at a hand washing station. Use water flow strong enough to wash away food bits. Yeah, I guess that's enough on that. You can't let the temperature of the food go above 41 degrees or more than 4 hours. So it has to be under running water that is drinkable at 70 degrees or lower. Okay, you can also thaw TCS food in a microwave. But if you do that, then you have to cook it immediately. You can't thaw it out in a microwave and then put it into a cooler. You can also thaw food as part of the cooking process. So things like frozen French fries, you can take them right out of the freezer, put them into the fat, and fry them. Frozen hamburger patties, you can put those onto a grill and cook those. There's all sorts of things that you can take right out of the freezer and thaw it by cooking. Okay. Anybody remember what ROP stands for? Does the picture help at all? No, it's not wrong. ROP stands for, shoot, it just ran out of my head. Reduced oxygen packing. Okay, so that they have machines called a cryovac machine that pulls all of the air out of the package and then seals it. So it's reduced oxygen packing, and that will reduce the growth of bacteria because there's no oxygen for it to grow. But that type of food has to be thawed carefully. If the label states that the product must remain frozen until use, then remove the fish from the packaging before you thaw it in the cooler, or before or immediately after thawing under running water. So if you have fish fillets that are frozen and individually packed, you might want to just leave them in the plastic to thaw them out under the cold running water and then remove that plastic instead of having all that water come in direct contact with the fish and actually change the texture of the fish. If you are packaging using a reduced oxygen packing method, we have cryovac machines here. We often are doing that type of packing. You want to make sure that it's frozen either before, during, or after the packaging. First question that comes to mind is how do you do it during the packaging? And we don't have it here, but some manufacturers have like quick freeze machines. It's like a conveyor belt. The product goes onto its like the little sheet that would be in a case of, and the only instance I can think of is frozen oysters on the half shell. So they've got cleaned shells, they've got cleaned oysters married up on a pack, a dozen on each sheet. It's on a conveyor belt. It gets frozen within 10 seconds as it's going through that, frozen completely solid. And then it actually lands right into a case. Phil puts 5 of those sheets into it, and then the machine closes and tapes up the case, and it slides down the conveyor belt and into the freezer. So that's a way that you can freeze something while you're packing it. And then include a label that states that the fish must be frozen until it's used. Okay, whenever it comes to prepping produce, so lettuces, vegetables, fruits, make sure that that produce doesn't come in contact with any surface that has come in contact with meat, fish, or poultry. Wash the produce thoroughly before you cut it, before you cook it or combine it with other ingredients. So to wash produce, use running water a little warmer than the produce. So if we have whole heads of lettuce, where, what temperature do we have to have those stored at? Does it have to be below 41 degrees? Whole heads of lettuce. Are whole heads of lettuce a TCS food? What kind of lettuce is a TCS food? Pardon me? Not the bag. Sliced lettuce. So like once you have cut it up out of the whole head, then it becomes a TCS food. So we're going to be washing it before we cut things up. So you can store the heads of lettuce at a higher temperature than 41 degrees. You don't want to do that for a very long time because it's going to reduce the shelf life, but you can let them get warmer than 41 degrees because you're going to have a hard time getting water cold enough. Like 50-degree water doesn't come out of the faucet, not in Louisiana. Okay, so you don't want the water temperature to be that much higher than the temperature of the lettuce because it's going to shock it too much. There's too much of a temperature change in it. It'd be almost like cooking it. So we want to pull apart any type of leafy greens, make sure we're getting all of the dirt and critters that might be in there washed off. There are some chemicals that can be used to wash produce. We don't have to know the names of those for the exam. You also have the option of, if you've got like several cases of lettuce to wash, you can fill a sink up with cold water, as long as the sink is cleaned and sanitized. Take a case of lettuce, submerge it all into that sink, use that water to clean the one case of lettuce. But then as soon as that's done, you have to empty the sink out, clean, sanitize it before you can clean more product in it, even if it's another case of lettuce. Refrigerate and hold sliced melons, cut tomatoes, and cut leafy greens at 41 degrees or lower. So those are TCS. Once those items are cut, then they have to be kept in the cooler. Also, do not serve raw seed sprouts if you primarily serve a high-risk population. So if you're working hospital, nursing home, daycare center, anybody that has a compromised immune system, you want to make sure that you're not serving raw seed sprouts. Okay. Has anybody ever heard of the term pooled eggs? Doesn't mean a whole lot, except you crack the eggs and put them into a container, and that's called pooling them. So these are pooled eggs. If you are allowed to work with pooled eggs, there are some things that you have to do. You're either going to cook those promptly or you're going to refrigerate them. Clean and sanitize containers between batches. So usually when you're doing something like this, it might be that you're going to make scrambled eggs. And it might be like you're doing a station at a buffet and you scramble up a bunch of fresh eggs and you have a container that keeps it cold, and then you're out in the buffet area making omelets to order, that type of thing. You can't just take that bucket and then go back and crack more eggs into it. You'd have to get one cleaned and sanitized. You also would want to consider using pasteurized shell eggs, which looks like any other kind of egg except that it's gone through a process to pasteurize the eggs. And it should be indicated on it that it has been pasteurized. We also have egg products. We have pasteurized egg whites. If you use egg beaters, you can get those at the grocery store. You can either get them colored yellow or just the plain egg whites. Those are pasteurized products. They're usually, they are refrigerated or they come frozen. In the industry, we can also get pasteurized egg yolks and pasteurized egg liquid. It usually comes like in a 2.5 gallon bag. And we used it at the casino because we made recipes that had huge amounts of eggs. That saved a lot of time. Dishes that need little or no cooking. Let's see if I don't think it's going to come up. A Caesar salad dressing. It's classically made tableside using raw egg yolks. If you make your own mayonnaise that uses raw egg yolks, if you make different types of desserts, tiramisu can have uncooked egg products in it. Meringues are typically uncooked. So you would want to use pasteurized eggs to reduce the chance of bacteria being in the product. Takes care when serving a high-risk population. If you are serving those raw or undercooked dishes, use a pasteurized product. You can use unpasteurized regular eggs, just like you can get it in the grocery store, if they're going to be cooked, like in a cake or in an omelet, or something where that thing is cooked the whole way through. But if you're working with a high-risk population, you would want to use eggs that are pasteurized if you're going to pool them. Okay. Salads that contain TCS foods. So things like chicken salad, pasta salad, tuna salad. Only use the leftover TCS food as if it was cooked, held, cooled, and then stored correctly. So you've got to be conscious all the time when you're cooking anything that you might use again in either a salad or some other way. You have to do everything properly. Do not use leftover TCS food that has been held for more than 7 days. Okay, so Monday's lecture where we talked about food labeling and the date that you put onto it. Any TCS food that you prepare in-house, you cannot keep it more than 7 days. Okay. Make ice. Whenever you're using ice, make sure that it comes from water that is safe to drink. Never use ice as an ingredient if it was used to keep food cold. So again, this container, I might fill it up with ice and add water to it, and then put in something that I needed to cool down. Maybe like a gallon of gumbo in a container. I might just put it into here. I can't later take that water and ice and use it like in a stock or for anything else. I would have to throw that away. The containers and scoops. Where is this one? Okay. Scoop is kept in a container outside of the ice bin so that the handle where people's possibly contaminated hands won't come in contact with ice. Never hold ice in containers that held chemicals or raw meat, seafood, or poultry. So something like this probably has in its life had raw meat, seafood, or poultry in it. So I couldn't just stick this beside the ice machine and keep the ice scoop in it. Never touch ice with your hands. It's really tempting to like just reach in there and put it into a glass. But we always use a scoop. We would never put a glass into an ice machine to just scoop the glass or ice into the glass. If that glass breaks, you're gonna have to empty the whole ice machine and make sure there's no glass in it. Okay. Sometimes when you prepare food, let's see, sometimes you can buy it already prepared, some of these ways that we're going to talk about, but might be considered unique or customized to your operation if you do it from scratch in your own operation. So if you have like a grove of orange trees that you can take the oranges and you can squeeze them and make orange juice out of it, you need to at least label it that it could possibly cause a foodborne illness, or you would need to get a variance from the health department, meaning that they would have to come in and see what your plan is to not keep people sick. If you're smoking food to preserve it, but not to enhance flavor. So has anybody ever smoked food? What was it? Trout. Okay. So when you smoked it, was it cooking as part of that process, or was it smoked and then cooked? It was cooked and then smoked. Okay. But in any case, like if you were smoking it in order to like be able to keep it for months, that's when you would need a variance. But if you're going to smoke it and eat it, that's fine. You might have a smoker set up to smoke like a fresh ham instead of buying one that's already been processed. If you're using food additives or components to preserve or alter food so it no longer needs time and temperature control for safety. So if you've ever seen like pickled eggs, anybody ever seen like a jar of pickled eggs? Okay, so there's enough vinegar and acid in there and it's canned, and you don't have to put that in the refrigerator. Normally you would have to keep eggs in the refrigerator. But if you're doing that in your restaurant, you need to have a variance from the health department. If you're curing food, you can cure food with a brine or a rub. Basically what that's doing is pulling the moisture out of the protein, and you can cure food to extend its shelf life. But again, if you're doing that in-house, you need a variance from the health department. Also, if somebody you know gets a deer during hunting season, they can't just bring it to your restaurant and have you butcher it for them. You need to have a variance from the health department if you're going to do something like that in a restaurant. If you are packaging food using a reduced oxygen packing method. So we have a procedure that had to be approved by the health department for a variety of foods that we would pack in cryovac. If you're sprouting seeds or beans that you're going to be serving fresh, or if you're offering live shellfish from a display tank, Most often you see like a tank of lobster. If you see a tank of anything, it is going to be served to guests. Okay. I'll put these slides in here because HACCP is Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. And it ties in directly to when you need a variance. And HACCP has a lot of steps to it, and it addresses all of the things that you would need in order to get a variance from the health department. So it has to account for food safety risks. Most of these processes that we just talked about involve holding food at a long time at room temperature. But we have like a brine or something that we've added to it to reduce the possibility of bacterial growth. You have to comply with your plan and procedures, and you have to document what time you did this, what temperature was the thing, was the product, and you have to have that for every time that you do it. And then when the health department comes in, they can ask you, okay, where are your records for all the hands you've done over the last 3 months? So the records have to show your following procedures for monitoring critical control points. So that usually involves time and temperature, like how long was something at this temperature? How long did it take to cool it down properly? Having records of you actually taking the temperature and the time, verifying the effectiveness that your standards are really meeting the goals of not having bacterial growth, and then taking necessary corrective actions if there's a failure at a critical control point. Okay. So when you're cooking TCS food, you're going to have to reach a minimum internal temperature and hold that temperature for a specified amount of time. The temperatures are going to be important. The times are going to be semi-important. So whenever we check temperatures, you take a probe that is appropriate for the type of food that you're doing. On the screen here, we've got a steak, nice big piece of meat that you would use your regular instant read thermometer, but that's really not appropriate for thin hamburger patties. You need a different probe for that. And you want to make sure that you're checking in the thickest part of meat. So if you have something like a chicken breast on the left-hand side, you're sticking it into the thicker part of the breast, which is going to be at the lowest temperature, as opposed to taking it at the thin part of the breast, which would be cooked faster. Okay, so minimum internal cooking temperatures for different foods. Okay, so the highest minimum temperature that we have to cook food to is 165 degrees. And we're going to start at the top and work down. And as long as that food reaches that, it's instantaneous. As soon as you see 165 degrees on these foods, you can pull them out of the oven. So poultry, whether it's whole, whether it's ground, chicken, turkey, or duck. So any type of poultry has to be cooked to 165 internal temperature. Any type of stuffing that is made with meat, fish, or poultry. Any meat, seafood, poultry, or pasta that is stuffed has to reach 165 degrees. And dishes that include previously cooked TCS ingredients. So if you had leftover chicken and you weren't going to make chicken salad, but you might make some type of a chicken casserole where you throw in a bunch of pasta and cream and vegetables and cheese and bake that off, that's going to have to come up to 165 degrees because that chicken was previously cooked. And of course it's chicken. Okay, the next temperature range is 155 degrees. And we're holding this for 17 seconds. So any type of ground meat that is not poultry, so any kind of beef, pork, other types of meat have to be 155. Anything that's injected, so if you take your Cajun injector and you're inserting some type of a brine or spice mix into the meat, it has to reach a temperature of 155 degrees. And that's because you're possibly taking bacteria from the surface of the meat and introducing it to the center. Mechanically tenderized meat. Anybody ever seen meat that's been mechanically tenderized? Have you ever seen a Swiss steak or steakums? Okay. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. It's usually a tough cut of meat that runs through like a machine that has probes in it, and it's cut pretty thin, but those probes help to tenderize it. It's like taking a meat mallet and pounding something. You're tenderizing it by doing that, but you're also breaking through the surface of it. So you've got to cook those up to 155 degrees. If you are using ground meat from game animals that were commercially raised and inspected, that has to be cooked to 155 degrees. Ratites, which are ostrich and emu, any of the cuts from that have to be cooked to 155 degrees. Ground seafood, chopped or minced seafood. You see clams that are chopped or minced. Any other seafood that you see chopped up or minced? I guess somebody could chop up raw shrimp if they were doing something that you needed to chop shrimp. Shell eggs that will be hot held for service. Okay, so that brings my other shell down. Anybody know what this is called? Okay, have you ever seen anything like it before? Okay, I'm gonna put it down here. Okay, this is called a chafing dish. The way that it works, it's used on a buffet. So there's a pan that's in the bottom here. That's where you put some hot water, and then underneath that, you're gonna put a flame. This one doesn't fit under this one, but we have containers that do fit under that. And if you go on a buffet, you're gonna see that hot food is in this type of a dish. And then we might put something in here like scrambled eggs for a breakfast buffet. And they're already cooked, and they're hot. And this is designed to keep them warm. And it has cover on it so that people don't hop onto it or contaminate it. Okay? So that would be holding food for service. It's in a chafing dish. It's going to be out there for a certain period of time. So if we had scrambled eggs in a dish like that, if you ever go to a hotel and get breakfast, they're going to have something like that set up. Okay, minimum internal cooking temperature at 145 degrees for 15 seconds is the rest of our seafood, whole pieces of seafood or steaks of seafood, fish, shellfish, and crustaceans, so all of those things. Medium size cuts of pork, beef, veal, and lamb So like steaks or chops need to reach 145 degrees for 15 seconds. Commercially raised game and shell eggs that will be served immediately. So as opposed to the eggs that we're holding here on a buffet that have to be 155 degrees, if we're making a plate of eggs for a guest to eat, that only has to reach a temperature of 145 degrees. Okay. Don't get too overwhelmed by this one. If you have bigger cuts, like large roasts of meat, beef, pork, veal, lamb, it has to reach 145 degrees for 4 minutes instead of the 15 seconds, because it's a bigger piece of meat. You want to be sure that it's held at that temperature for that longer amount of time. They have alternate cooking temperatures. If you want to cook it to a lower temperature, you have to hold it at that temperature for a longer period of time. And there are ovens that will not go over the specified temperature that you want that product to be. And they can measure the time that they're held at those temperatures. You don't have to memorize those. You don't have to remember any of those. The only time I've ever seen a question about this was at a culinary quiz bowl competition. It will not be on the exam. What you do have to remember is 145 degrees for 4 minutes for any of these roasts. Pardon me? How would you measure the temperature or the time? We have ovens that have thermometer probes in them, so you would put that in there and it actually can record how long it's held at that temperature. Okay, and then our lowest required cooking temperature is 135 degrees. That's food from plants, fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, which are beans, that are going to be hot held for service. So they're going to be put into something like a chafing dish or a buffet, or like the extra that you have that you're holding in the kitchen to go out on the buffet is going to be kept in what we call a hot box. It's usually electric plug-in, and it's going to hold the food at a warm temperature. It has to be held at least 135 degrees. Okay, now we're going back up to the top. Anytime we cook a TCS food, no matter what it is, in a microwave, it's got to go up to 165 degrees. So meat, seafood, poultry, eggs, all of those would have to go up to 165 degrees when cooked in a microwave. Does anybody want to put seafood in a microwave until it reaches 165 degrees? Probably not. Okay, you're going to dry it out. It's going to get that nasty, fishy taste to it. When you do cook food in a microwave oven, there's some general tips in case you've never used a microwave. You want to cover the food to prevent it from drying. For even cooking, if your machine doesn't have a rotation wheel in it, you have to rotate it or stir it halfway through the cooking process. Let the covered food stand for a couple of minutes before you check the temperature, and then check the temperature at least in 2 places. So again, it's got to reach 165 degrees in the microwave. Partial cooking during preparation. So if you have like a large banquet for 500 people, you might consider cooking food like a day ahead of time, or at least partially cooking it to reduce the amount of things you have to do the day of the actual event. So in this photograph, we have partially cooked chicken breasts. It has the date on it that it was done. You never cook the food longer than 60 minutes during the initial cooking process. So you wouldn't want to do something that takes a super long time to cook. Something like chicken breasts would be easy to partially cook and cool quickly and get them into storage, and then cut down the time that you would need to cook them on the following day. Or you could refreeze the food and then pull it out and thaw it whatever the day it was. Okay, if you are refrigerating it, of course it has to be below 41 degrees, and you would want to keep it away from ready-to-eat foods. Then when it comes time to actually serving it, you have to heat it to the proper temperature. And then if you have leftovers, you can cool it down again. Okay. You should have basically a recipe for how you're going to do this. All the steps listed down for how you're going to, when you're going to take temperatures, and how you're going to keep records of what the temperature of the food was for how long. Which corrective actions will be taken if the requirements are not met. We haven't gone through the cooling off process, but you'll see that there are timelines for doing that properly. How we're going to label these items that have been partially cooked, and then how we're going to store that partially cooked food. So all of that should be part of the recipe for making chicken breasts for a large party. We also have consumer advisories. Disclose any raw or undercooked time temperature control items that are on the menu. So if you're going to serve a rare hamburger, your guests need to know that they would be taking a risk of getting a foodborne illness by eating it. Same thing with like oysters on the half shell. The fresh sprouts, the unpasteurized juices that you do in-house. And I think you've seen those kind of things on menus, especially if you go into like a Japanese restaurant where they're serving sashimi or sushi. Advise people that there is an increased risk of foodborne illness. And the Food and Drug Administration advises that we don't serve those kind of things to children who are preschool. So any type of undercooked meat, poultry, seafood, or eggs. One example of an uncooked meat is called steak tartare. Has anybody ever had steak tartare? Anybody know what it is? Okay, so basically they take fresh steak, they get a really good sharp knife, and they just chop it up. It doesn't go through a grinder or any other type of machine. It's cut by a knife. They have some like an acidic dressing that's added to it and seasonings that's added to it, but it's served at a refrigerator cold temperature. Okay, so you are eating raw meat, but you wouldn't serve that to children because there is a chance that they could get foodborne illness, and they haven't developed their immune system yet, so it could be really dangerous for them. Okay. Also, don't serve raw seed sprouts, raw or undercooked eggs unless they are pasteurized, or raw or undercooked meat or seafood. Also, any unpasteurized milk or juice cannot be served if your operation is serving high-risk populations. Okay, cooling requirements. Okay, so we basically have the temperature danger zone from 135, we're cooling it down to 41 degrees. We've got a total of 6 hours to do that, but from the 135 down to 70 degrees. That's more of the super temperature danger zone. We only have 2 hours to do that. So we've got to measure that that cools down to 70 degrees within 2 hours, whatever it is, whether it's a gumbo, whether it's a turkey, chicken, whatever it is, we've got to be able to measure that in 2 hours time, that has come down to 70 degrees. If after those 2 hours, it's 80 degrees, we can reheat it above 135 and then start over again. As long as we get it down to 70 degrees within 2 hours, then we have 4 more hours to get it down to 41 degrees. So that makes up our total of 6 hours. But it's very important that we get those down to 70 in the first 2 hours. You might be able to get it down to 70 degrees in less than 2 hours. You might be able to do that in an hour. Whatever time you have from that, that will add on to the time to get it down to 41 degrees. So if some way you are able to get it down to 70 degrees in 1 hour, then you would have 5 more hours to get it down to 41 degrees. Okay. Factors that affect the cooking, or the cooling, I'm sorry. Cooking also, but we're talking about cooling. The thickness or the density of the food. So in this photograph, it looks like we have some tomato sauce that we're going to be cooling down. That's going to take a little bit longer to cool down than something like just a plain chicken broth. It's because of the consistency of it. If we had something like jambalaya, that's probably going to take even longer to cool down because it's more dense than a liquid is. So the size of the food, if we have large batches, if you have to make a 40-gallon batch of stock or of gumbo, you're not going to be able to cool that whole 40 gallons down very efficiently within 2 hours. So you're going to make smaller containers. You can also using shallow pans with a larger surface area is more effective than using like tall, narrow container, because basically the heat is only coming out of the top of it instead of through the sides. Stainless steel transfers heat away from food faster than plastic. Shallow pans, again, we just talked about that. Okay, so we have a couple of things that we can do if we need to cool something down. In this type of a container, if we have something like maybe a couple of quarts of gumbo, but fill this up with ice and cold water, and then put the container or 2 different containers of the gumbo in here, and that's going to be a nice water bath to be used. We also have this thing, an ice paddle. So I could put, as long as this is clean and sanitized, I could put the gumbo in here and use this to stir it around and pull it off, because this is in the freezer. It's 32 degrees. If I really wanted to be really fast, I'd get a deep metal container, put it in there, put that in an ice water bath, and then put this on the inside of it. So it would go a lot faster. Place it in a blast chiller. This is a machine that looks kind of like a refrigerator, all the shelving in it. It's got a high-speed fan in it, and it cools food down quickly. It has probes in it that measure the temperature and records how long it takes to reach the temperature that you're wanting, and it prints out a little receipt. So that's your documentation. Another thing that you can do is, after you cook something like a gumbo, you might put less liquid in it to begin with, and then you can throw ice cubes into it so that it's not too watery, but it would make the consistency right and cool the food down at the same time. Okay, so once we get them down to 70 degrees, we put them into the cooler usually to get them down to 41 degrees. You don't want to tightly cover those things because that's going to hold the heat in. So you might want to take some aluminum foil and just loosely place it over the top. It can be left uncovered as long as it's protected from contamination so that there wouldn't be a danger of something else contaminating it. Make sure that these things are stored above other foods, especially any type of raw seafood, meat, and poultry. So now we've got our food cooled off. We're going to talk about reheating it for service. So if I'm reheating something, say I'm running a diner and I have like leftover roast beef in the cooler and somebody wants a hot roast beef sandwich, I can slice off some roast beef, stick it in a pan with a little bit of sauce, and I can warm it to any temperature. I could even put it on the sandwich cold, but they want a warm one. So I can get it warm, but I don't need a minimum temperature because I'm serving it immediately. Okay, if I'm going to hold it or if I'm going to put out sliced roast beef in a chafing dish, then I've got to get that up to 165 degrees within 2 hours. So whatever it is, if it's gumbo that I've got to get out for a buffet, it's got to reach 165 degrees within 2 hours of me taking it out of the cooler. If you're heating commercially processed, packaged, ready-to-eat food, it's got to get to at least 135 degrees if you're putting it out on a buffet to be held. Okay, so chapter 6, 3 questions. How are we doing keeping up with quizzes? I put zeros in for all the quizzes that were not completed to this point. Email me if that affects you, and we can work on getting those made up. Alrighty. Friday is going to be a review day, so you probably want to make sure that you watch the videos. I've been looking to see how many people are watching the videos on the days they don't come, and it's a really tiny number. So you're missing like half of the information in the class when you don't watch the videos. And I know it's probably not the most exciting thing to do, but you're really going to want to do it. Okay, we'll see you on Monday.